There are very few figures in the ancient world who managed to be both historically documented and genuinely mysterious at the same time. Himiko is one of them.
We know she existed. We have a Chinese chronicle written by scholars who had access to people who had actually traveled to her kingdom that describes her in considerable detail. She ruled a kingdom. She conducted diplomacy with one of the most powerful empires in the world. She was taken seriously by people who did not take peripheral rulers seriously unless they deserved it. And yet, despite all of this, she remains fundamentally unknowable. We do not know exactly where she ruled. We do not know what she looked like. We do not know her birth name because Himiko may itself be a title rather than a personal name. We do not know the full nature of her power, though we have a single tantalizing word that points toward it.
Kido.
That word is where we begin tonight.
The Chinese chronicle called the Wager was compiled in the 3rd century by scholars of the Kingdom of Wei, one of the 3 kingdoms that divided China after the collapse of the Han Dynasty. It contains an account of diplomatic contact between Wei and the Hua people, the inhabitants of the Japanese islands, and within that account, a description of Himiko and her kingdom that is the most detailed portrait we have of any figure in pre-literate Japanese history. The Weiju tells us many things about Himiko, that she was a woman, that she never married, that she lived in a large, heavily guarded palace surrounded by towers and walls, that she was served by 1,000 female attendants, that she communicated with the outside world only through her younger brother, that she sent an embassy to the Wei court in 239 and received in return a gold seal, bronze mirrors, and fine silks. And it tells us that she practiced Kido. The 2 characters that make up this word mean, roughly, the way of the spirits. It refers to a method of communicating with supernatural powers, of accessing knowledge and authority from beyond the ordinary human world, and using that access to govern, to heal, to divine the future, and to maintain the cosmic order on which the welfare of the community depended. The Chinese scholars who wrote this description used the word in a slightly dismissive way. They said she used Kido to deceive the people. This tells us less about what Himiko was actually doing than about how educated Chinese men of the 3rd century viewed religious practices they did not fully understand or respect. The word deceived is their judgment, not a description. What Kido actually was in practice is one of the most fascinating questions in all of ancient Japanese history. To understand what Himiko was doing, we need to understand the world she lived in. The Japan of the 2nd and 3rd centuries was not a world that divided the natural from the supernatural, the political from the religious, the practical from the spiritual. These were not separate categories. They were aspects of a single reality, and the most powerful people were those who could move fluently between them. The rice that sustained the community grew or failed depending on the weather, on the water, on forces that were only partially within human control. Illness struck without apparent cause. Children died. Enemies attacked. The future was uncertain in ways that were genuinely threatening to survival. In this world, the ability to communicate with the forces that govern these outcomes was not a luxury. It was a necessity. A ruler who could access the will of the spirits, who could determine the right time to plant and the right time to fight,
who could intercede with the powers that controlled the rain and the harvest, was a ruler whose authority was grounded in something real and urgent. Himiko had this ability, or she was understood to have it, which in the practical terms of political authority amounted to the same thing. She was what scholars of comparative religion call a shaman, a person who could cross the boundary between the ordinary world and the spirit world, who could navigate the invisible landscape of supernatural power, and who could bring back from that navigation knowledge and authority that no one else could access. The tradition she belonged to was ancient and widespread. Female spiritual specialists who served as intermediaries between human communities and the powers that govern their lives appear throughout the ancient cultures of East Asia. In Korea, they were called mudang. In the Japanese tradition that developed from these roots, they were called miko. They danced, they sang, they fell into trance states in which the spirits spoke through them. They performed divination, reading the will of the supernatural powers in the cracks of heated bones, in the flight of birds, in the movement of fire and water. Himiko was the most powerful such practitioner that ancient Japan produced, powerful enough to rule a kingdom, powerful enough to conduct diplomacy with China, powerful enough that when she died, the people refused to accept a male successor and demanded instead a young girl from her own lineage.
Her power was real, and tonight we are going to understand exactly what it consisted of. The first and most fundamental element of Himiko's power was her ability to communicate with the spirits of the dead. In the religious world of ancient Japan, the boundary between the living and the dead was not absolute. The dead did not simply cease to exist. They continued, in a different form, in a different realm, but they remained present in the world of the living in ways that were both helpful and potentially dangerous.
Ancestors were among the most important spiritual presences in ancient Japanese religious life. The spirits of powerful individuals, chiefs and leaders, and those who had died in circumstances of particular intensity, retained their influence after death. They could protect their descendants. They could provide guidance in moments of crisis. They could intercede with the larger cosmic powers on behalf of the living community. But accessing this ancestral power required a specialist, someone who could cross the boundary, who could enter the realm where the ancestors dwelled and communicate with them directly, and who could bring back what she found there.
This was one of the core functions of Himiko's Kido, her seclusion in the inner palace, surrounded by her female attendants, her refusal to appear publicly, her communication with the outside world only through her brother. These were not simply political strategies, though they were that too. They were the conditions required for the maintenance of her spiritual purity and her spiritual function. A shaman who wants to communicate with the dead must maintain a careful separation from the contaminating influences of the ordinary world. Death itself was considered a source of pollution in ancient Japanese religious understanding. Contact with death, with blood, with the messy biological processes of ordinary life could disrupt the shaman's ability to cross the boundary cleanly. Himiko's seclusion protected her capacity to do her work. The walls and towers around her palace were not just military defenses. They were spiritual barriers, maintaining the integrity of the sacred space in which the most important work of the kingdom was carried out. Inside that sacred space, Himiko communicated with the ancestors. She received their guidance. She transmitted it through her brother to the world outside, and the kingdom was governed accordingly. The second element of Himiko's power was divination. Divination is the practice of determining the will of supernatural powers through the interpretation of physical signs. It is one of the most universal human practices, found in virtually every culture in every period of history, and it served a specific and important function in ancient societies.
In a world without reliable information about the future, without meteorological forecasting, without medical diagnosis, without the statistical tools we use today to assess risk and probability, decisions were genuinely uncertain in ways that are difficult for modern people to fully appreciate. Should we plant now or wait for more rain? Should we go to war or seek negotiation? Is this illness something that will pass or something that will kill? Divination provided a method for making these decisions that went beyond ordinary human judgment. By accessing supernatural knowledge, by reading the will of the powers that actually govern outcomes, the diviner could provide guidance that was understood as more reliable than mere human assessment.
The specific techniques that Himiko used for divination are not described in the Weiji, but the broader context of ancient East Asian religious practice gives us a good idea of what was likely involved. The most prestigious form of divination in ancient East Asia involved the application of intense heat to the shoulder blades of deer or to turtle shells, and the interpretation of the cracks that appeared as a result. This practice was highly developed in Shang Dynasty China, where the questions asked and the answers received were inscribed on the bones themselves, creating the Oracle Bone Archive that is one of the most remarkable documents in the history of human religious practice. Versions of this practice appear in the archaeological record of the Yayoi period in Japan. Deer shoulder blades with the characteristic burn marks of divination practice have been found at multiple sites. The practice was present in Japan, and it was present in exactly the period when Himiko was ruling her kingdom. Whether Himiko herself performed this divination, or whether specialist practitioners performed it under her direction, we cannot say. But the use of physical objects as a medium for accessing supernatural knowledge was almost certainly part of the ritual complex that surrounded her. There were other forms of divination as well. The behavior of birds, which were understood as messengers between the human world and the spirit world, was read for signs. The patterns of fire and smoke, the movement of water, the appearance of unusual natural phenomena, all of these could be interpreted as communications from the powers that govern the world. Himiko presided over a court in which these communications were constantly being sought, received, and interpreted. The governance of Yamatai was not simply a matter of human decision-making. It was a continuous process of consultation with the supernatural world, mediated by a woman whose special capacity for that consultation was the foundation of her authority. The third element of Himiko's power was healing. Disease in the ancient world was understood as a disruption of the relationship between a person and the spiritual powers that maintain their health and vitality. Illness was not simply a physical malfunction. It was a sign that something had gone wrong in the invisible world. that a spirit had been offended, that a taboo had been violated, that some kind of spiritual intervention was required to restore the balance. The shaman's role in healing was therefore not merely the application of physical remedies, though plant medicines and other physical treatments were also used. It was the diagnosis and correction of the underlying spiritual problem. The shaman entered the spirit world, determined the nature of the disruption, negotiated with the offended powers, performed the rituals necessary to restore balance, and returned to the ordinary world with the knowledge of what needed to be done. Himiko's palace, with its 1,000 female attendants and its continuous ritual activity, was among other things a center of healing. People came to her with illnesses that ordinary treatment had failed to cure. They came with problems that seemed to have no natural cause. They came when they needed access to the kind of knowledge and intervention that only her spiritual capacity could provide. The healing she provided was not simply placebo. In a world where the relationship between psychological and physical well-being was understood in ways that modern medicine is only beginning to catch up with, a healing ritual that genuinely altered the experience and understanding of an ill person could have real physical effects. The belief that one had been healed, that the offending spirit had been appeased, that the cosmic balance had been restored, could itself contribute to recovery in ways that are physiologically real. And the social function of healing should not be underestimated. In a small community, illness is not just a personal crisis, it is a community crisis. A leader who could effectively address illness was a leader who addressed one of the most fundamental anxieties of communal life. Himiko's healing capacity was part of what made her authority legitimate in the eyes of the people who lived under it. The fourth element of Himiko's power was her relationship with the forces that governed weather and harvest. Rice agriculture depends on the weather with an intimacy that is difficult to appreciate from inside a modern industrial food system. Too little rain at the wrong time and the crop fails. Too much rain at the wrong time and the crop fails. A late frost, an early storm, a summer drought, any of these could mean the difference between abundance and starvation for a community that depended on the harvest for its survival. The spirits that govern the weather, the kami of rain and wind and sun, were among the most important powers in the ancient Japanese religious world. And the ruler who could communicate with those powers, who could intercede with them, who could ensure through ritual action that the weather remained within the bounds that the rice needed, was performing one of the most valuable services that a ruler could perform. Himiko's authority was understood to include this capacity. Her relationship with the supernatural powers extended to the powers that govern the conditions of agricultural production. When the harvest was good, it was in part because of her intercession. When it failed, it was a sign that something in the cosmic order had been disrupted and that her rituals needed to address it. This gave her a leverage over the community that was both practical and deeply psychological. She was not simply a ruler. She was the person on whom the community's survival literally depended, not just in the political sense that a ruler is necessary for social order, but in the cosmic sense that her relationship with the powers that govern the world was what stood between the community and catastrophe. No one challenged Himiko lightly, not because of her army, though she had one, but because to challenge Himiko was to risk disrupting the relationship with the supernatural powers that protected the community. It was to put the harvest at risk. It was to invite disaster. That is a form of power that goes beyond anything that military force alone can produce. It is power that operates at the level of fundamental human anxiety about survival. And Himiko wielded it with considerable skill. The fifth element of Himiko's power was something harder to name. Call it presence through absence. The wager tells us that Himiko rarely appeared in public, that she communicated through her brother, that her palace was heavily guarded and difficult to access, that even her closest attendants saw her only in specific circumstances. This invisibility was itself a form of power. In many religious traditions, the most sacred things are the most hidden. The Holy of Holies in the Jerusalem temple could be entered by only one person once a year. The most sacred objects in many indigenous traditions are kept hidden from ordinary view, shown only in specific ritual contexts. The divine is often understood as something that cannot be looked at directly, that must be approached through veils and intermediaries and carefully controlled circumstances. Himiko's seclusion placed her in this category. By making herself invisible, she made herself sacred. By limiting access to her person, she increased the value of that access. By communicating through her brother rather than directly, she surrounded her words with an aura of removed authority that direct communication would have diminished. The people who governed in her name, who transmitted her commands, who managed the day-to-day operations of the kingdom, did so with the authority of someone who had been in her presence. The brother who served as her intermediary was not simply a messenger. He was the person who had access to the sacred center, and that access itself conferred authority. This is a sophisticated political and religious technology. The invisible ruler whose actual power is magnified by their absence. The sacred figure whose rarity makes every appearance, every word, every gesture more significant than it could ever be if they were constantly visible and accessible. Himiko understood this, or the tradition she participated in understood it, and she embodied it. Either way, the result was a form of authority that was genuinely unusual and genuinely formidable. There is one more aspect of Himiko's power that deserves attention, and it is perhaps the most personal. She chose never to marry. In the ancient world, this was an extraordinary choice for a woman, particularly a woman of high status. Marriage was the expected path. It was the means by which alliances were forged between powerful families. It was the way that political relationships were sealed and legitimized. A woman who refused marriage was refusing one of the primary social roles available to her. Why did Himiko refuse it? The most convincing answer connects to everything else we have discussed. The kind of spiritual authority that Himiko wielded required a specific kind of purity, a separation from the ordinary entanglements of social life, a freedom from the obligations and the contaminating influences that marriage and family would have brought. A married woman was embedded in a web of relationships with her husband's family, with her own family, with the children she was expected to produce. These relationships created obligations, dependencies, vulnerabilities. They divided loyalty. They compromised the single-minded dedication to the spiritual work that Himiko's role required. By remaining unmarried, Himiko remained undivided. Her loyalty was to the spirits and to the kingdom, and to nothing and no one else. Her power was concentrated rather than dispersed. Her identity was defined entirely by her function rather than by her relationships. This was not simply a personal choice. It was a spiritual discipline, as demanding in its way as the physical disciplines of any ascetic tradition. And it was, in the context of her world and her role, a source of power rather than a limitation. A woman who belonged to no man belonged to the spirits. And in Yamatai in the 3rd century, that was the most powerful thing a person could be. When we try to understand Himiko across the 17 centuries that separate us from her, we face the fundamental problem that all historical understanding involves. We are looking at a person through the distorting lenses of time, of culture, of the specific sources that happen to survive, and of our own assumptions and preconceptions. The Chinese scholars who described her saw her through the lens of Chinese cultural assumptions about women, about barbarian peoples, about religious practices that differed from the rationalistic traditions they valued. The Japanese scholars who have studied her across the centuries have brought their own assumptions, shaped by the specific political and cultural concerns of their own periods. We see her through the lens of the 21st century, with all of its particular blind spots and biases. What we can say with some confidence is this: Himiko was a woman of extraordinary capability who operated in a world that gave her specific tools for the exercise of power, tools that were different from the tools available to most rulers in most periods of history, but no less real for that. She understood her world. She understood the sources of authority available to her, and she used them with intelligence and skill. She built something durable enough to survive her death, at least partially, in the form of a successor who carried on her tradition. She was, in a word that is often used carelessly but that applies here with precision, remarkable. A shaman queen in a kingdom we cannot locate, practicing a form of power we can only partially reconstruct, leaving behind a name and a word, Kido, that has fascinated people for 2,000 years. She would probably find our fascination unsurprising. She understood, better than most, the power of the unseen. The word Kido appears only once in the wager. 2 characters, the way of the spirits. And yet those 2 characters have generated more scholarly debate, more speculation, more fascination than almost any other phrase in ancient Japanese history. Last time we talked about the broad outlines of Himiko's power. Tonight we go deeper. Tonight we look at the specific practices, the specific rituals, the specific techniques that the term Kido actually encompassed. Because Kido was not a vague spiritual sensitivity. It was a set of practices, a technology of the sacred, developed and refined over centuries, that Himiko had mastered to a degree that no one else in her world could match. To understand those practices, we need to start with a question that sounds simple but turns out to be deeply complex. What is a shaman exactly? The word shaman comes from the Tungusic languages of Siberia, from the word saman, referring to a specific kind of religious specialist found among the indigenous peoples of that region. In the 20th century, anthropologists adopted the term and applied it much more broadly, using it to describe similar kinds of religious specialists found across many cultures and many parts of the world.
A shaman, in this broader sense, is someone who can deliberately enter altered states of consciousness, and in those states interact with a spirit world that is understood to exist alongside and interpenetrating the ordinary world of everyday experience. The shaman travels in trance, in dream, in states of deep concentration or physical extremity. The shaman moves through landscapes that are not visible to ordinary perception and encounters beings that are not accessible through ordinary means. And the shaman brings things back: knowledge, guidance, healing power, the answers to questions that cannot be answered by ordinary means, the resolution of problems that have resisted ordinary solutions. The shaman goes to where the answers are and returns with them. This is the core of shamanic practice. Everything else, the specific rituals, the specific techniques for entering trance, the specific relationships with specific spirits, the specific forms of divination and healing, all of this is elaboration on this fundamental structure. And this fundamental structure is extraordinarily widespread. It appears in Siberia and in the Amazon, in ancient Korea and in the indigenous cultures of North America, in the traditions of ancient Japan and in the practices of contemporary healers, in cultures that never lost their pre-modern religious traditions. This widespread occurrence tells us something important. It tells us that shamanism is not a cultural accident, not a local peculiarity of any specific tradition. It is a human universal, a response to conditions of uncertainty and vulnerability that are themselves universal. When people feel powerless before forces they cannot control, when the future is genuinely uncertain and the stakes are genuinely high, they look for specialists who can access information and power from beyond the ordinary human range. Himiko was one of those specialists, the most powerful one that ancient Japan produced. The techniques of shamanic trance are remarkably consistent across different cultures and different periods of history. This consistency is itself significant. It suggests that the techniques work, that they reliably produce the altered states of consciousness that shamanic practice requires, and that different cultures discovering this independently arrived at similar methods because those methods are genuinely effective. The most universal technique is rhythmic sound. Drumming, in particular, at specific tempos, has been shown in modern neurological research to produce measurable changes in brainwave activity. Sustained drumming at around 4 to 7 beats per second, which falls in the theta frequency range, tends to produce the kind of deep, relaxed alertness associated with hypnagogic states. The states between waking and sleeping in which vivid imagery and unusual perceptual experiences are common. Ancient shamanic practitioners did not have neurological research to explain why drumming worked, but they had centuries of empirical observation confirming that it did. The drum became, in many shamanic traditions, the primary tool of the practitioner, so central to the work that it was often understood as a sacred object in its own right, the vehicle on which the shaman traveled to the spirit world. Whether Himiko used drums specifically, we do not know, but rhythmic sound of some kind was almost certainly part of her practice. The 1,000 female attendants in her palace were probably not silent. They sang, they chanted, they may have played instruments. The palace of Yamatai was, in all likelihood, a place of continuous sound, sound that served the specific function of maintaining the altered states of consciousness
that Himiko's work required. Fasting is another technique that appears consistently in shamanic traditions. Extended fasting produces physiological changes that include altered perceptual states. The body, deprived of its normal fuel, begins to metabolize differently, and the brain, running on ketones rather than glucose, can produce experiences that are distinctly different from ordinary waking consciousness. The great visionary experiences of many religious traditions, the visions of prophets and mystics and shamanic practitioners across many cultures, occur in contexts of fasting. This is not coincidence, it is physiology. The fasting body is a body in an altered state, and that altered state is, in the right context, a receptive state, a state in which perceptions and experiences that are normally filtered out become available. Himiko's seclusion may have involved fasting as a regular practice. The palace of Yamatai was a controlled environment, and the control extended to what Himiko ate and when. The maintenance of her spiritual capacity required the maintenance of specific physical conditions, and fasting may have been among those conditions. Isolation and sensory restriction are also documented as techniques for inducing altered states. Prolonged time alone, in darkness or in monotonous environments, tends to produce changes in perception that can include hallucinations, vivid imagery, and experiences that feel distinctly different from ordinary waking consciousness. Cave retreats, dark rooms, isolation in the wilderness, all of these appear in shamanic traditions as methods for accessing the spirit world.
Himiko's physical seclusion within the inner palace, her separation from the ordinary social world, may have served this function among others. The palace was not just a political residence, it was an environment specifically designed to maintain the conditions in which her spiritual work could be done.
The specific form of divination most closely associated with ancient Japan is called futomani, and it involves the heating of bones to produce cracks that are then interpreted as communications from the spirit world. The bones used were typically the shoulder blades of deer, though turtle shells were also used, following the practice of the Chinese oracle bone tradition that had been the most sophisticated form of divination in East Asia for centuries before Himiko's time. The process was specific. The bone or shell was prepared, cleaned and dried, and sometimes marked with specific symbols or patterns. A question was formulated, often with great care, because the precision of the answer depended in part on the precision of the question. The bone was then subjected to intense heat at a specific point, and the cracks that appeared were read by a specialist who understood the system of interpretation. The reading was not random. There was a developed tradition of interpretation, a knowledge of which patterns of cracking corresponded to which kinds of answers, which orientations and shapes indicated favorable outcomes, and which indicated danger. This knowledge was accumulated over generations, refined by experience, and transmitted carefully from practitioner to practitioner. Whether Himiko performed the bone divination herself or presided over specialists who performed it for her, we do not know. In some shamanic traditions, the paramount figure is the one who formulates the questions and interprets the answers, while the more mechanical aspects of the ritual are performed by assistants. In others, the paramount figure performs the entire ritual. Either model is consistent with what we know about Himiko's court. What we can say is that divination of this kind was almost certainly practiced in Yamatai. The archaeological record of the Yayoi period shows burned deer shoulder blades at multiple sites, clear evidence that the practice was widespread in exactly the period and region where Himiko ruled. The Wage's description of her as someone who used supernatural means to determine courses of action is entirely consistent with a system of bone divination providing the answers to questions of policy and strategy. Imagine the scene. A question of some importance has arisen. Should the kingdom send an embassy to Wei? Should the military response to a neighboring chiefdom be aggressive or conciliatory? Is this a good time to attempt a major agricultural project? The question is brought to Himiko, or rather, it is brought to her brother, who brings it to her. She considers it. In her inner chambers, in conditions of controlled environment and altered consciousness, she formulates the question in the precise terms that the divination system requires. The bone is prepared and heated. The cracks appear. And from those cracks, from the specific pattern of fractures in a piece of deer shoulder blade, the course of the kingdom is determined. This is not superstition, or not merely superstition. It is a decision-making system that served the specific needs of a specific society in a specific moment in history. It provided a mechanism for resolving uncertainty that went beyond the ordinary conflicts of opinion and interest that any political system has to manage. When the bone spoke, the question was settled. The authority of the answer came not from any human source, but from the powers that govern the world. In a society where that authority was genuinely believed in, that settlement was real. Beyond bone divination, Himiko's Kido almost certainly encompassed practices that we would today describe as mediumship, the direct communication with spirits, the transmission of messages from the dead to the living, the serving as a vessel through which the voices of the ancestor world could speak. This practice is documented throughout East Asian shamanic traditions and persists in modified forms in many contemporary cultures in the region. The Mudang of Korea, female shamans who have maintained their tradition more or less continuously from the ancient period to the present, perform elaborate rituals in which they are understood to be possessed by specific spirits, to speak with the voices of the dead, to transmit messages and demands from the spirit world to the living. The Miko tradition of Japan, the female ritualists associated with Shinto shrines, represents a transformed version of the same basic function. The Miko of the ancient period were not simply shrine attendants. They were spiritual specialists capable of being entered by the kami, of transmitting the divine will in forms that the community could understand and act on. Himiko stands near the origin of this tradition. The 1,000 female attendants in her palace were almost certainly the community of practitioners who maintained the ritual infrastructure that her work required. They were the chorus to her lead, the supporting practitioners whose collective effort maintained the spiritual environment in which her more powerful and more specific capacities could operate. Some of these women were probably themselves capable of trance states and spirit communication, though at a level less powerful than Himiko herself.
They formed a graduated community of spiritual capacity, with Himiko at the center and various levels of ability and function arranged around her.
This kind of organized community of spiritual practitioners appears in other ancient contexts. The oracular establishments of ancient Greece, most famously Delphi, operated on a similar principle, a central figure with the most direct access to the divine, supported by a larger community of priests and priestesses who maintained the infrastructure and mediated between the oracle and the ordinary world. The palace of Yamatai was, in this sense, the Delphi of ancient Japan, a place where the most important questions were brought and where answers came from beyond the ordinary human range. The question of whether Himiko actually communicated with spirits is one that modern historians approach with appropriate caution. The honest answer is that we do not know what Himiko experienced in her altered states. We cannot verify from the outside whether her experiences corresponded to any external reality. What we can say is that she experienced something, that those experiences were consistent enough and reliable enough to form the basis of a political system that functioned for decades, and that the people around her found her claims convincing enough to organize their lives around them.
This is not nothing. In fact, it is quite a lot. The capacity to enter states of consciousness that differ significantly from ordinary waking experience is real and documentable. Modern neuroscience has confirmed what shamanic traditions have maintained for millennia, that human consciousness is far more variable than ordinary life suggests, and that the states accessible through specific techniques can produce experiences that feel, to the person having them, as genuinely informative as any ordinary perception. Whether the information received in those states comes from external spirits or from the depths of the practitioner's own mind is a question that neuroscience cannot currently answer. What it can say is that the experiences are real, that the altered states are real, and that practitioners who have developed genuine expertise in accessing and navigating these states can produce results that exceed what ordinary cognition would predict. Himiko was almost certainly a genuine practitioner, not a fraud, not a clever politician using the appearance of spiritual power to manipulate credulous followers. She was someone who had developed real expertise in real practices that produced real experiences, and who used those experiences in the service of her kingdom with skill and intelligence.
The Weiji says she deceived the people, but the Weiji was written by Chinese scholars who believed that spirits did not actually communicate with human beings through bone divination and trance states. They thought it was deception because their worldview had no category for what Himiko was doing that was not deception.
We do not have to share their limitations.
The relationship between Himiko's spiritual practice and her political authority was not simply that one provided cover for the other. They were genuinely integrated in ways that made each stronger.
Her spiritual authority made her political authority legitimate in the eyes of her people. A ruler whose decisions came from the spirit world could not be easily challenged on ordinary political grounds. You could disagree with a chief whose decisions were based on his own judgment. You could not as easily disagree with the decision that came from the ancestors. But her political authority also supported her spiritual practice.
The resources of the kingdom maintained the palace and the community of practitioners. The military power of the kingdom protected the sacred space from disruption. The administrative capacity of the kingdom implemented the decisions that the divination produced. The two systems reinforced each other, creating a form of authority that was more stable and more resilient than either political power or spiritual authority alone could have been. This integration of the political and the sacred is not unique to Himiko. It appears in many ancient societies, in the divine kingship traditions of Africa and the ancient Near East, in the theocratic systems of pre-Columbian Mesoamerica, in the god-king traditions of Southeast Asia. But in Himiko's case, the integration had a specific character that was shaped by the specific traditions of her world. She was not a king who was also divine. She was a spiritual specialist who was also a political ruler. The order matters. Her spiritual capacity came first. Her political authority grew from it, was dependent on it, would have collapsed without it. This is why, when she died, the people would not accept a male successor. A man could have the political office, but a man could not have what Himiko had, the specific spiritual capacity that made the office meaningful. And without that capacity, the office was hollow. They needed another woman. They needed another Himiko. They found one, young and untested, but from the right lineage, carrying in her blood whatever it was that Himiko had carried. And for a while at least, it was enough. The shaman queen was gone, but the tradition she embodied was not. It would continue, transformed and adapted but recognizable through all the centuries of Japanese religious history that followed. In the Miko of the Shinto shrines, in the Itako, the blind female mediums of northeastern Japan who maintained the practice of communicating with the dead well into the 20th century, in the religious traditions of Okinawa, where female spiritual specialists called yuta continue to practice forms of spirit communication that would have been recognizable to Himiko.
She is gone, but she is not entirely gone. The way of the spirits, the Kido, did not die with her.
It changed, it scattered, it took new forms in new contexts, but something of it persists in the oldest layers of Japanese religious life, in the practices that have survived the longest and changed the least. Something of Himiko persists there,
waiting perhaps to be understood. The Weija mentions them almost in passing. 1,000 female attendants serving Himiko in her inner palace. 1,000 women living and working within the walls of Yamatai, dedicated entirely to the service of a single ruler. This is one of the most striking details in the entire account of Himiko, and it is one of the most under-examined. Historians have spent enormous energy debating where Yamatai was, and whether Himiko was a shaman or a politician, and what Kido really meant. But the 1,000 women are often treated as background detail, a number that indicates Himiko's wealth and power and nothing more. They were not background detail.
1,000 women living in a single palace complex was a community, a large, organized, purposeful community of women who spent their entire lives in a specific place, performing specific functions in service of something they understood to be of the greatest importance. Who were they? Where did they come from? What did they actually do? And what was it like to be one of them? These are questions that the wager does not answer, but they are questions worth asking, because behind every great historical figure are the people who made their work possible. And behind Himiko, making everything possible, were 1,000 women whose names we will never know. Let us start with where they came from. A community of 1,000 women does not assemble itself. It is built deliberately over time through processes of selection and recruitment that tell us something about how Yamatai was organized. Some of these women were almost certainly daughters of the elite families of the Yamatai Confederation, sent to the palace as part of the complex system of alliance and obligation that held the political structure together. In many ancient political systems, the sending of daughters to the court of the paramount ruler was both an honor and a form of political loyalty. The family that sent a daughter to serve Himiko was demonstrating its commitment to the Yamatai order and binding itself to that order in a personal and intimate way. Some were probably selected for specific qualities. The spiritual work that Himiko's palace centered on required people with specific capacities. Not everyone can enter trance states. Not everyone has the sensitivity and the training to function as a spiritual practitioner. Those who showed promise would have been sought out and brought to the palace from across the territory of the Confederation to be trained in the practices that the palace required. Some were probably born into the palace community, daughters of women who had served before them. A community of 1,000 women that was maintained over decades would have had children, and those children, growing up within the palace walls, learning its practices and its values from infancy, would have been natural candidates for continued service. And some perhaps came for reasons we cannot reconstruct, circumstances of personal history, family decisions, the specific dynamics of individual lives that brought them to this place rather than to the ordinary life of a yayoi farming community. Whatever their origins, once they arrived, their lives were shaped entirely by the palace. The palace was their world. Its rhythms were their rhythms. Its purposes were their purposes. What did they do? All day, every day, within those walls? The wager does not tell us, but we can make reasonable inferences. The most important function of the palace community was the maintenance of the ritual and spiritual work that was Himiko's primary purpose. This required continuous effort from many people. Someone had to tend the fires that burned in the ritual spaces. Fires that may have been understood as sacred in themselves, connections to the spiritual world that could not be allowed to go out. Someone had to prepare the materials used in divination, the bones that would be heated, the shells that would be read. Someone had to maintain the objects of spiritual significance, the bronze mirrors, the ritual implements, the sacred spaces themselves. Someone had to sing. Music was almost certainly central to the ritual life of the palace, and a community of 1,000 women would have had considerable musical capacity. Chanting, singing, the rhythmic sound that facilitated trance states and communicated with the spirit world. These required voices and the training to use them effectively. Someone had to dance. Ritual dance, the physical expression of spiritual states, the embodied communication with the invisible world, was almost certainly part of the ceremonial life of the palace. The female ritual specialists of ancient East Asia danced. It was part of their practice. part of what they did when they entered the states in which the spirits could be accessed. And someone had to take care of the practical necessities of a large community of people living in a single complex. Food preparation on a scale that fed 1,000 people daily, the maintenance of the buildings, the management of water and waste, the care of the sick, the education of the young, all of the practical infrastructure of communal life, invisible in the historical record, but absolutely necessary for the community to function. The 1,000 attendants were not simply decorative, they were the operational staff of an institution of enormous complexity, each one contributing her specific skills and capacities to a collective enterprise whose ultimate purpose was the governance of a kingdom through spiritual means. Now let us talk about what they wore. The clothing of the Yayoi period is known to us from a combination of archaeological evidence and the descriptions in the Chinese chronicles. The wager itself contains a brief description of the clothing worn by the Wa people, and while it is not specific to Himiko's court, it gives us a starting point. The people of the Wa, the chronicle tells us, wore garments made by folding cloth around the body without cutting or sewing, fastened with a knot or band. This description corresponds to a style of wrapped clothing that was common across ancient East Asia and that required considerable skill to wear elegantly. The cloth itself was woven from plant fibers, primarily rami and other bast fibers that could be processed from the stems of certain plants. Hemp was also used. The weaving technology of the Yayoi period was not primitive. Fragments of woven fabric have been preserved at some Yayoi sites, and they show a level of technical accomplishment that could produce cloth of considerable fineness. Silk was known in the Yayoi period, though it was rare and valuable. The Wei Emperor's gifts to Himiko included fine silks, which suggests that silk was understood as a luxury material of the highest prestige. Within Himiko's palace, the most important women, those closest to the center of spiritual and political power, would have worn silk when it was available. The ordinary attendants would have worn the finer grades of plant fiber cloth. Color was significant. In many ancient cultures, the color of clothing indicated social status, and the Yayoi world was probably no exception. The specific color associations of the period are not documented, but red, made from iron oxide pigments, and certain plant-derived dyes were available and were used to color cloth. The clothing of the palace community was almost certainly distinguished from the ordinary clothing of farming communities by its quality, its color, and its style. Footwear in the Yayoi period was minimal. Straw sandals, similar to those worn in Japan until modern times, were the most common form. They were woven from rice straw or other plant materials, simple in construction but effective for the purpose. Within the palace complex, on the polished wooden floors of the ceremonial buildings, the women may often have been barefoot, as was the custom in formal indoor settings across East Asian cultures. Jewelry and ornamentation were important markers of status and spiritual significance. Magatama, those curved jade ornaments that we have encountered throughout Japanese prehistory, were worn as pendants and in necklaces. Glass beads, imported from the continent, were highly valued. Shell bracelets, made from large shells imported from the southern seas, were worn by those of high status. The most important women in Himiko's court,
those who participated most directly in the ritual work may have worn specific ornaments that marked their spiritual function. Bronze mirrors worn as pendants, reflecting the sacred significance of the mirror in the religious world of the period. Specific arrangements of magatama that indicated their role in the palace hierarchy. We are speculating, of course. The specific details of palace dress and ornamentation in Yamatai are not documented, but the broader context of Yayoi period material culture, combined with what we know about comparable courts in the region, gives us a picture that is at least plausible.
What did they eat?
The diet of the Yayoi period was centered on rice, but it was considerably more varied than that central fact suggests.
Rice was the prestige food, the food that marked you as a participant in the agricultural civilization that the Yayoi had brought to Japan, cooked in ceramic vessels, served in wooden bowls, eaten with the hands or with simple utensils. Rice was the foundation of every meal for those who had access to it.
But rice was supplemented by a wide variety of other foods. The Yayoi people continued to exploit the extraordinary natural richness of the Japanese environment that the Jomon had lived on for 14,000 years before them. Fish from the rivers and the sea, shellfish from the coastal waters, wild game from the forests, gathered plants, nuts, and berries from the surrounding countryside. In the vicinity of Himiko's palace, which was in a major settled area of the Yayoi world, the food supply was more varied and more reliable than in smaller, more isolated communities. The agricultural surplus of the surrounding region flowed to the center. The tribute and gifts that subordinate chiefs sent to Yamatai included food as well as other goods. The palace kitchen was feeding 1,000 people every day. This was a serious logistical operation, requiring organization, storage, preparation, and distribution on a scale that most Yayoi communities never approached. The management of the food supply for the palace community was itself a significant administrative function, one that required skill and experience. Specific foods that were probably part of the palace diet include millet, barley, and various root vegetables in addition to rice, soybeans and other legumes, pickled and fermented foods, which were important for preservation in a world without refrigeration, fish prepared in various ways, dried, salted, fermented into paste, wild vegetables and herbs gathered from the surrounding countryside, fruits in season. The consumption of meat from land animals was probably limited, not because it was prohibited, but because the raising of domestic animals for meat was not yet a significant part of the Japanese agricultural system. Pigs and chickens were kept, but they were not the primary source of protein that they became in some other ancient civilizations. Fish and shellfish were the main animal protein sources. Alcohol was almost certainly part of the dietary world of Yamatai. Fermented beverages, made from rice or millet, were produced and consumed across the Yayoi world. In ritual contexts, alcohol played an important role in many ancient cultures, lowering inhibitions, facilitating altered states, serving as a vehicle for communion with the divine. Whether the spiritual practices of Himiko's court incorporated ritual drinking, we cannot say with certainty, but it would not be surprising. Now let us turn to personal hygiene. What did people in Yamatai do about their teeth, their hair, their bodies?
The question of oral hygiene in the ancient world is one that is rarely addressed in histories of ancient Japan, but it is worth considering because it tells us something about the quality of daily life in ways that more dramatic topics do not. The Yayoi people did not have toothbrushes in any recognizable sense. They did not have toothpaste. And yet, the evidence of dental disease in Yayoi period skeletal remains is actually not dramatically worse than in many pre-modern populations. This suggests that they were doing something to maintain oral hygiene, even if not what we would recognize as tooth cleaning. Chewing on fibrous plant materials, including certain kinds of wood, is a method of cleaning teeth that is documented in many pre-modern cultures, and that is actually reasonably effective at removing food particles and stimulating the gums. The use of salt as a cleaning agent, rubbed directly on the teeth with the fingers, was also practiced in various ancient cultures and would have been available in coastal and near coastal areas like much of Yamatai.
The diet itself may have helped. A diet low in refined sugars, which were essentially absent from the Yayoi world, reduces the bacterial activity that causes tooth decay. The Yayoi ate foods that required significant chewing, which stimulates saliva production and natural cleaning processes. Hair care was significant in the Yayoi world. The elaborate hairstyles shown on some of the Haniwa figures, which represent the fashions of the somewhat later Kofun period, but which probably reflect traditions that had developed during the Yayoi, suggests that hair was an important marker of social status and identity. The women of Himiko's court almost certainly devoted considerable attention to their hair. Combs made of wood and bone have been found at Yayoi sites, evidence that hair was groomed carefully. Oils derived from plants, particularly from the seeds of the camellia tree, were used to condition and style hair, a practice that continues in Japan to this day. The camellia oil of the Yayoi period was not the refined cosmetic product of modern manufacture. It was a simple pressed oil, extracted from camellia seeds by heating and pressing. But it was effective, giving hair a healthy sheen and making it more manageable. The women of the palace who had the resources and the time to devote to personal appearance would have used it regularly.
Bathing in the Yayoi period was done in rivers, in the sea, or in heated water prepared in ceramic vessels. Japan's abundant hot springs, found throughout the volcanic islands, were certainly used for bathing where they were accessible. The concept of ritual purification through water, which is central to Shinto practice and which may have its roots in the Yayoi period, would have given bathing a significance beyond simple hygiene in the palace context.
Body decoration may have included tattooing. The Weiju mentions that the men of the Wa people tattooed their faces and bodies, and while it does not specifically mention women doing so, the practice was widespread enough in the region that it may have extended to the women of the court as well. If Himiko's attendants wore tattoos, they may have been marks of their spiritual function, visual indicators of their role in the palace community. And now, the question that has occupied Japanese scholars for more than 1,000 years. Where was Yamatai? This is not simply an academic question. The location of Himiko's kingdom has implications for the continuity of Japanese history, for the relationship between Himiko and the later imperial family, for the question of where Japan, as a political and cultural entity, actually began. The Weiju provides directions for reaching Yamatai from the Korean peninsula. Starting from a specific point on the Korean coast, You travel south and east by sea for a certain distance, then south again, then southeast, and eventually you arrive.
The problem is that these directions, if followed literally on a modern map, do not lead to Japan. They lead to the middle of the Pacific Ocean, somewhere southeast of Kyushu. The distances and directions in the chronicle are clearly not perfectly accurate. This has given rise to two main schools of interpretation, each with a long history and passionate advocates. The first is the Kyushu theory. Proponents of this view argue that the directions in the wager, while not perfectly accurate, are roughly consistent with the location in northern Kyushu, the westernmost part of Japan closest to the Korean peninsula. The Yoshinogari site in Saga Prefecture, one of the largest and most complex yayoi settlements ever excavated, is often cited as the most plausible candidate for Yamatai, or at least for a major center of the Yamatai Confederation. The Kyushu theory has the advantage of geographical plausibility. Northern Kyushu was the first part of Japan to be settled by Yayoi immigrants from the continent, and it maintained closer connections to the Korean peninsula and to continental East Asia than any other part of Japan throughout the Yayoi period. The diplomatic contact with Wei that the chronicle describes would have been most easily conducted from a location in Kyushu. The second theory places Yamatai in the Kinai region, the area around what is now Nara and Osaka. This is the Kinai theory, and it is based primarily on the argument that Yamatai and Yamato, the name of the region that became the heartland of the Japanese state in the subsequent Kofun and Asuka periods, are the same word in different transcriptions. If Yamatai is Yamato, then Himiko's kingdom was the direct ancestor of the Japanese imperial state. The line from Himiko to the modern emperor, however attenuated and transformed by the intervening centuries, would be continuous. The first ruler of Japan we can actually name would be a female shaman, and the political tradition that produced the world's oldest continuous monarchy would have its roots in her specific form of authority. The implications of this interpretation for Japanese national identity and for the understanding of the imperial tradition are significant enough that the debate has sometimes taken on a political dimension that goes beyond purely historical scholarship.
The Kinai theory has the advantage of historical plausibility in a different sense. The Yamato region became by far the most important political center in Japan during the Kofun period, and its dominance seems to have been established relatively early. If the political tradition that produced Yamato dominance goes back to Himiko, the continuity makes a kind of historical sense. Neither theory has definitively won the argument. The archaeological evidence can be interpreted to support either position. The textual evidence is too ambiguous to settle the question, and new excavations occasionally produce findings that seem to support one side or the other, only to be interpreted differently by scholars on the opposing side. The debate will probably never be resolved with certainty. The evidence that would settle it definitively, a contemporary inscription identifying a specific site as Yamatai, or the discovery of Himiko's tomb with her name on it, has not been found and may not exist.
But the debate itself is valuable. It keeps alive a set of questions that matter for understanding Japanese history and Japanese identity. Where did Japan begin? Who was its first ruler? What kind of authority did that ruler exercise? Himiko sits at the center of all these questions, mysterious, documented, real, and forever slightly out of reach. That is perhaps exactly where a shaman queen belongs. We have spent considerable time talking about what Himiko did, the rituals she performed, the spirits she communicated with, the political system she built and maintained, the palace she inhabited, the women who served her. But there is a question that almost everyone asks when they first encounter Himiko, and it is one that historians tend to sidestep because the honest answer is uncomfortable. What did she look like? We do not know. We have no portrait of Himiko. No description of her physical appearance survives in any source. The Weiji, which is so specific about her political arrangements and her spiritual practices, is entirely silent on the question of her appearance. And yet the question is not unanswerable. Not completely. Because we know something about the people of her world, about the physical characteristics of the Yayoi population, about the standards of appearance and beauty that prevailed in that time and place. And from that context, we can build a picture that is not a portrait, but is not nothing either. The Yayoi people were, on average, somewhat taller than the Jomon people who preceded them and whose descendants they partially were. Studies of skeletal remains from Yayoi period sites show average heights of roughly 160 to 163 centimeters for men and 150 to 153 centimeters for women. These are not dramatically different from modern Japanese averages, though modern Japanese people are somewhat taller on average as a result of improved nutrition over the past century. The Yayoi facial structure was somewhat different from the more robust features of the Jomon. Flatter faces, less pronounced brow ridges, somewhat narrower features. These characteristics reflect the genetic contribution of the continental East Asian populations who brought rice farming to Japan, who had developed different physical characteristics in the different environments of the mainland. Himiko, as a woman of the Yayoi world, probably had these broadly East Asian features: dark hair, dark eyes, the kind of face that would not look dramatically out of place among modern Japanese people, though the specific details of her individual appearance are lost. Her hair was almost certainly long. Long hair was the norm for women of status in the ancient Japanese world, and the elaborate hairstyles shown on Kofun period Haniwa figures, which reflect fashions that developed during and after the Yayoi period, show hair arranged in complex coils and knots that required considerable length to achieve. The women of Himiko's palace devoted serious attention to their hair, as we discussed in relation to the 1,000 attendants. Himiko herself, as the center of the palace community and the most important figure in the kingdom, would have had access to the most skilled hair arrangements and the finest camellia oil. Her hair would have been a mark of her status, carefully maintained and elaborately arranged on ceremonial occasions. Her clothing, as we have discussed, would have been of the finest materials available, silk when it was available, the finest plant fiber cloth, dyed in colors that marked her as the paramount figure, wrapped in the style of the period, but with an elaborateness that distinguished her from the ordinary attendants. The bronze mirrors that she received from the Wei Emperor, and the magatama and glass beads that were markers of the highest status,
would have been part of her ceremonial appearance. When Himiko appeared, on the rare occasions that she appeared at all, she would have presented herself as a visual embodiment of the spiritual and political authority she held. Every element of her appearance would have been carefully calculated to reinforce that authority. We imagine her then, a woman of middle height by the standards of her time, dark hair, carefully arranged, fine clothing of the best available materials, the bronze mirrors and jade ornaments of her status. An expression that, if the Haniwa tradition gives us any guide to the aesthetic ideals of the period, was composed and inward, suggesting an attention directed at something beyond the ordinary visible world. We imagine her, but the imagination is working from evidence, not from nothing. How did Himiko become queen? This is one of the most interesting questions about her, and it is one that the Weiji addresses, though briefly and without the detail we would like. The chronicle tells us that before Himiko's rule, there had been a period of disorder in the Wa lands. Male rulers had led to conflict between the various communities of the Confederation. The disorder lasted for some time, wars and raids and the instability that comes when no single authority is accepted as legitimate by all the competing powers.
And then Himiko was installed as ruler, and the disorder ended.
The chronicle presents this as a consequence of her installation rather than a coincidence. She became ruler, and peace followed. The implication is that her authority was of a kind that the male rulers had lacked, a kind that was accepted where theirs had been contested. What kind of authority was that? We have spent 2 episodes exploring the answer. It was spiritual authority, the authority that comes from being understood as a genuine intermediary between the human world and the world of the spirits. The authority that is grounded not in military force or political maneuvering, but in the perception that this specific person has access to a source of legitimacy that transcends any merely human claim. But this still does not answer the question of how Himiko specifically came to be recognized as having this authority. Who recognized it first? How was the recognition communicated and established across the multiple communities of the Confederation? How was a consensus reached that this woman, specifically, was the one? The tradition of female shamanic authority in the region gives us some clues. Female spiritual specialists in ancient Korea and Japan were often recognized from an early age, when they showed signs of the specific capacities that the tradition valued: unusual sensitivity to the spirit world, the ability to enter trance states, dreams or visions that were understood as communications from the ancestors. Himiko may have shown such signs from childhood. She may have been identified early as someone with exceptional spiritual capacity and trained accordingly by older practitioners within the palace tradition or within the religious institutions of her community. The Yoshinogari site in northern Kyushu, which some scholars identify as a possible location of Yamatai or a comparable center, shows evidence of a large ceremonial complex that would have been the institutional home of spiritual practices similar to those Himiko is described as performing. If Himiko grew up within such an institution, or was brought to it when her capacities were recognized, her training would have been systematic and thorough. By the time she reached adulthood, she would have been not just a practitioner, but the most accomplished practitioner of her generation, recognized within the palace community as the one whose capacities were sufficient for the paramount role. The political recognition followed the spiritual recognition. The chiefs of the various communities that made up the Yamatai Confederation accepted her authority because her spiritual legitimacy was genuine and because the alternative, continued conflict under male rulers whose authority was contested, was worse.
She was chosen, but she was chosen because she was genuinely extraordinary. Now let us turn to something lighter. What did people in Yamatai do for fun? This is a question that serious historians sometimes dismiss as trivial, but it is not trivial at all. What a society does for pleasure tells you as much about its values and its inner life as what it does for survival or power. The wager gives us one direct piece of evidence. It notes that the Wa people were fond of sake, rice wine, and that drinking was accompanied by singing and dancing. This is consistent with what we know about festive culture across the ancient world. Alcohol lowered inhibitions. Music and dance expressed emotions and created communal bonds. The festival, the gathering of community around shared pleasures, was one of the most universal forms of human social life.
The festivals of the Yayoi period were not simply entertainment. They were also religious occasions, moments when the boundary between the ordinary world and the spirit world was understood to be thinner, when the kami were present and responsive, when the actions and offerings of the community could influence the divine powers that govern their lives. Music was central to these occasions. The instruments of the Yayoi period included bells, the bronze dotaku that we have discussed at length, and various percussion instruments. String instruments may have been present, introduced from the continent. Flutes made of bone or reed produced melodic sounds. The human voice in chant and song was the most accessible and probably the most important instrument of all. Dance accompanied the music. The specific forms of Yayoi dance are not documented, but ritual dance traditions from the region give us some sense of what they may have looked like. Slow, formal movements performed in specific sequences, each movement carrying symbolic meaning, or ecstatic movement, bodies expressing the presence of the divine in ways that formal choreography could not contain. Children played. The archaeological record includes objects that are clearly toys, small clay figurines that children would have played with, objects that seem designed for games rather than for practical use. The children of the palace community, growing up within its walls, would have had their own world of play within the larger adult world of ritual and governance. Storytelling was almost certainly a major form of entertainment and education simultaneously. The tradition of oral narrative that we have discussed in the context of the Jomon, the transmission of knowledge and cultural value through story, continued through the Yayoi period and beyond. On long evenings, in the communal spaces of the palace, stories were told. The myths of the origin of the world, the histories of the ancestors, the tales of heroes and spirits, and the encounters between the human and the divine. These stories were not written down. They lived in the mouths of the tellers and the ears of the listeners, passing from generation to generation in the way that all oral traditions pass. Some of them eventually found their way into the written chronicles of the Nara period, the Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki.
transformed by centuries of transmission and by the specific concerns of the people who finally wrote them down. But in Yamatai in the 3rd century, they were still living stories, still being told by firelight to audiences who heard them as news about how the world worked, not as mythology about a distant past. Games requiring skill were probably played. Board games and competitive games are documented in ancient cultures across East Asia and the world. The specific games of the Yayoi period are not documented, but some form of competitive play, combining skill with entertainment, was almost certainly part of the recreational life of the community. Archery was both a practical skill and a competitive activity. The Yayoi world required skilled archers for hunting and warfare, and the practice and refinement of archery skill would have had both a practical and a recreational dimension. Competitions between skilled archers, judged on accuracy and form, would have been both entertaining and socially useful, maintaining and displaying the military capacity that the community needed.
Fishing, for those with access to rivers or the sea, was both a food-producing activity and a form of recreation. The patience and skill required for successful fishing, the quiet attention to the water and the behavior of the fish, the satisfaction of a successful catch, make fishing a natural recreational activity as well as a practical one.
And there was beauty, the beauty of the landscape, the changing seasons, the quality of light on water, the sound of wind in the forest. The Yayoi people were not so absorbed in survival that they could not notice beauty, and the aesthetic sensibility that would eventually produce the exquisite literary and visual culture of the Heian period had its roots in this older attentiveness to the natural world.
Himiko's palace, within its walls and towers, was not separate from the natural world. The seasons came to it as they came everywhere. The cherry blossoms of spring, the cicadas of summer, the falling leaves of autumn, the silence of winter snow. The women of the palace experienced all of this, and in experiencing it, they were part of a long tradition of Japanese attentiveness to the natural world that has never entirely ended.
One more aspect of Yayoi life deserves attention before we move on: the relationship between the living and the ancestors. We have talked about Himiko's communication with the spirit world as a specialized, high-level practice, but the relationship with the ancestors was not limited to specialists. It was part of everyday life for ordinary people in the Yayoi world. The dead were not forgotten. They were present in the specific places where they were buried, in the memories of the living, in the rituals that were performed to honor them and maintain the relationship between the living community and those who had gone before. Every significant decision, every major agricultural activity, every important transition in the life of the community was accompanied by acknowledgement of the ancestors. Before planting, you acknowledged those who had planted before you. Before harvest, you acknowledged those whose labor had created the agricultural knowledge and the agricultural infrastructure that made your harvest possible. Before war, you acknowledged those who had fought before you. This continuous acknowledgement was not simply sentiment, it was understood as practically necessary. The ancestors were sources of power and protection, and that power and protection had to be maintained through proper relationship. Neglect the ancestors, and their protection would be withdrawn. Honor them, and they would continue to watch over the living. Himiko's role as the supreme intermediary between the living and the dead was therefore not separate from ordinary religious life. It was the peak of a practice that was woven throughout the daily experience of everyone in Yamatai. She was the most powerful practitioner of something that everyone participated in at their own level, in their own way.
That connection between the specialist and the ordinary community is what made her authority feel natural rather than imposed. She was not doing something alien to the people she ruled. She was doing what they all did with a power and a skill that they could recognize and respect, even if they could not themselves achieve it.
She was one of them, just more so.
And in that recognition, in that combination of the familiar and the extraordinary, lay the deepest foundation of her authority.
Himiko died sometime around the middle of the 3rd century. The exact year is not recorded. The Weiji simply notes her death, briefly as a fact, and moves on to describe what happened afterward. But before we talk about what happened afterward, let us sit with the death itself for a moment. A woman who had ruled a kingdom for decades, who had built a system of authority unlike anything that had existed in Japan before, who had conducted diplomacy with China, who had maintained peace among communities that had been fighting before she came to power, who had, by any reasonable measure, been one of the most consequential figures in the ancient history of the Japanese islands. She died, as everyone does, and the world she had built immediately began to shake. The Weiji tells us that after Himiko's death, a great burial mound was constructed for her. More than 100 of her attendants were buried with her. This is the passage that has sent archaeologists searching the Japanese countryside for more than a century. Somewhere in Japan, beneath the earth, lies the tomb of Himiko, the most important burial from the most important figure of the Yayoi period, a time capsule from the 3rd century, containing objects that could answer questions that have occupied scholars for generations. If it has ever been found, we do not know it. Several sites have been proposed as candidates for Himiko's tomb over the years. The most prominent is the Hashihaka Kofun in Nara Prefecture, a large keyhole-shaped burial mound that dates to roughly the right period, and that is located in the Yamato region. It is associated in Japanese historical tradition with a female figure, Yamato Totohimomoso Haima, who is described in the Nihon Shoki in terms that have suggestive parallels with the description of Himiko and the Weiji. The Hashihaka Kofun is impressive. It is one of the earlier large keyhole mounds, roughly 280 meters in total length, dating to the late 3rd or early 4th century. If it is Himiko's tomb, it would provide the most direct physical evidence connecting Himiko to the Yamato region and to the tradition that eventually produced the Japanese imperial state.
But the Hashihaka Kofun is imperial property, designated as a mausoleum of the imperial household, and the Imperial Household Agency has restricted archaeological investigation of it and other imperial mausolea for decades. The reasons given are a combination of reverence for the dead and practical concerns about the integrity of the structures. But the effect is that the mounds, most likely to contain the most important information about the origins of the Japanese imperial tradition, remain largely uninvestigated.
This is one of the great frustrations of Japanese archaeology. The answers to some of the most important questions about ancient Japanese history may lie within a few kilometers of central Nara, sealed in burial chambers that have not been fully examined. Other candidate sites for Himiko's tomb have been proposed in Kyushu, consistent with the Kyushu theory of Yamatai's location. The Hirabaru site in Fukuoka Prefecture, where an extraordinary assemblage of bronze mirrors was found in a burial of the right period, has been suggested by some scholars. The quantity and quality of the mirrors found there is consistent with the gift from the Wei Emperor that the chronicle describes. The bronze mirrors are a particularly important clue. The Wei Emperor sent Himiko 100 bronze mirrors as part of his diplomatic gifts. 100 mirrors is an extraordinary number. They would have been among the most valued objects in Yamatai, and they would almost certainly have been buried with Himiko when she died. A burial containing a large number of bronze mirrors of the right type and the right date is therefore a significant candidate for Himiko's tomb. The Hirabaru burial contained more bronze mirrors than any other burial of the Yayoi period discovered so far in Japan. The case for it as Himiko's tomb, or as the tomb of a figure of comparable importance in the northern Kyushu political tradition, is not weak, but it has not been definitively identified as Himiko's tomb either. The debate continues. The more than 100 attendants buried with Himiko are a haunting detail. 100 people. More than 100, the Weiji says, people who had lived in the palace, who had served Himiko, who had been part of the community that made her work possible. And when she died, they were buried with her. We have discussed this practice briefly before. Attendant burial, the interment of servants and retainers with a deceased ruler, was practiced in various ancient cultures. It reflected a belief that the relationships and hierarchies of this world continued into the next, that the ruler would need in death what she had needed in life. Whether the individuals buried with Himiko went willingly or were compelled, we cannot know. The practice feels brutal to modern sensibilities. In the context of its own time and place, it was understood differently. In some traditions, death in the service of a great ruler was understood as an honor, a way of ensuring that one's own existence after death was bound to someone of power and status rather than passed alone in the anonymous darkness. To be buried with Himiko was to be part of her retinue in whatever existence followed this one, to remain connected to the most powerful spiritual figure of the age, even after death. Whether this understanding made the prospect less frightening, we cannot say, but it was the framework within which the people of Yamatai understood what was happening. The attendants who were buried with Himiko were, in the understanding of their world, accompanying their mistress on her final journey. They were the ones she would need around her in the spirit world, as she had needed them in this one. Something about this is deeply moving, even across the enormous distance of time and culture that separates us from them. The loyalty that persisted beyond death, the relationships that were understood as more durable than life. Whether or not we share the cosmological framework that made such burials meaningful, we can recognize in them the human reality of devotion, of connection, of the belief that some things matter enough to follow wherever they lead. After Himiko's death, a man was placed on the throne. The wager does not give his name. It says only that after Himiko died,
a king was installed, and that the people did not accept him, and that conflict followed.
This conflict was not minor. The chronicle describes it as significant disorder, fighting that resulted in deaths and instability across the Confederation. The political structure that Himiko had built and maintained for decades began to come apart. And then a 13-year-old girl was placed on the throne. Her name is given in the chronicle as Iyo, or in some readings, Toyo. She was a relative of Himiko from the same lineage, and when she was installed, peace was restored. This sequence of events is remarkable for several reasons. First, the rejection of the male ruler. An adult man with a legitimate political claim to succession was tried and found wanting. The people, or those with the power to make such determinations, decided that a man was not what the situation required. The specific authority that Himiko had held was not transferable to a male successor, regardless of his political qualifications. This tells us something crucial about the nature of Himiko's authority. It was not simply political authority that happened to be held by a woman. It was a specifically female spiritual authority, grounded in the tradition of female shamanic practice in the region that could not be replicated by a man. The Yamatai Confederation had been built on that specific kind of authority, and without it, the Confederation could not hold together. Second, the selection of a 13-year-old girl. Iyo was a child. She had no political experience, no established relationships with the chiefs of the Confederation, no military capacity, no administrative track record. She was chosen for one reason only. She was from the right lineage, she was female, and she showed whatever signs of spiritual capacity that the tradition required. This is a powerful statement about the nature of the authority in question. It was not earned through experience or demonstrated through capability. It was recognized, identified in a specific person, validated by those with the knowledge to do so. Iyo had it. The man who had been tried before her did not, and having it was sufficient. Third, the restoration of peace. When Iyo was installed, the conflict ended. This is described as an immediate consequence. The fighting stopped, the Confederation stabilized, the people accepted the new authority. Why? What was it about a 13-year-old girl that could end a conflict that an adult man had failed to contain? The answer goes back to everything we have discussed about the nature of Himiko's power. The authority that held the Yamatai Confederation together was spiritual authority. The legitimacy that the various chiefs accepted was spiritual legitimacy. And that legitimacy was understood as residing in a specific tradition carried by specific people, recognizable to those who understood the tradition. Iyo carried it. The man who preceded her did not. That was the difference. And in the world of Yamatai, that difference was everything. The question of whether Himiko was an ancestor of the Japanese imperial family is one that touches the deepest questions of Japanese historical identity. The imperial family claims descent from the sun goddess Amaterasu through a lineage that the traditional chronicles trace back to the age of the gods. The historical accuracy of these genealogies is not taken seriously by modern historians as a literal account of events. They are mythological narratives, not genealogical records. but the question of whether there is a historical connection between the political tradition that Himiko represented and the political tradition of the Yamato state that eventually produced the imperial institution is a different question and a more tractable one. If Yamatai was in the Kenai region, as the Kenai theory suggests, then the connection is potentially direct. The political center that Himiko ruled from would have been in the same region that became the heartland of the Yamato state. The female shamanic authority that legitimized Himiko's rule would have been one of the foundations on which the later imperial tradition was built. The figure of the Miko, the female ritualist associated with Shinto shrines, is relevant here. The imperial institution has always maintained female ritual specialists in service of the divine ancestors. The most important of these is the Ise Grand Shrine, dedicated to Amaterasu, which has traditionally been served by a female high priestess chosen from the imperial family. This tradition of female sacred authority within the imperial institution is very old, possibly as old as the institution itself, and it resonates powerfully with the tradition that Himiko embodied. The female intermediary between the human world and the divine world, the woman whose spiritual authority legitimizes and supports the political order. Whether Himiko was literally an ancestor of the imperial family, or whether she was a parallel figure in a parallel tradition that eventually merged with the Yamato tradition, or whether the connection is more diffuse and indirect, we cannot say with certainty. What we can say is that the kind of authority she exercised, female, spiritual, legitimizing, connected to the divine ancestors, is deeply embedded in the oldest layers of Japanese imperial tradition. Whatever the specific historical connection, the resonance is real. The imperial tradition remembers, in its deepest and most ancient practices, something that looks very much like Himiko. There is a coda to Himiko's story that deserves to be told. After Io was installed and peace was restored, the Yamatai Confederation continued. Io sent her own embassy to the Wei court, or to its successor, the Jin dynasty that eventually replaced Wei. The chronicle records this contact, noting that Io maintained the diplomatic relationship that Himiko had established. This is significant. The political and diplomatic strategy that Himiko had pursued, the cultivation of Chinese recognition as a source of legitimacy within the Wa world, was continued by her successor. Io understood what Himiko had understood. The connection to China was valuable. It would be maintained. And beyond Io, beyond the Yamatai Confederation as a specific political entity, the tradition continued. The female spiritual authority that Himiko had embodied, the practice of communicating with the divine to govern the human, the integration of the sacred and the political that made the Yamato state possible, all of this persisted. It transformed. It adapted to new contexts, new political realities, new religious frameworks. When Buddhism arrived in the 6th century, it encountered a tradition that had been integrating spiritual and political authority for centuries, and the integration continued in new forms. The Miko of the Shinto shrines continued to serve as intermediaries between the human and divine worlds. The imperial rituals continued to acknowledge the divine ancestry that legitimized the throne.
the female sacred authority that had its most visible ancient representative in Himiko continued to be part of the deepest structure of Japanese religious and political life.
She is not a remote figure from a disconnected past. She is a beginning. One of the beginnings of the tradition that eventually produced the Japan we know. A woman alone in an inner palace, surrounded by 1,000 women, communicating with the dead, governing the living, mysterious and powerful and real, the shaman queen of Yamatai. She is still there, if you know where to look, in the oldest rituals, in the deepest practices, in the thread of female sacred authority that runs from the 3rd century to the present. Thin in places, interrupted in others, but never entirely broken. Himiko, the sun child, the beginning of something that has not ended yet.